have always been the responsible one in my family, the one who people turn to when things go wrong, the one expected to fix what others break, and the one who never seems to say no no matter how much is asked of me. It wasn't always like this, of course. As a kid, I had dreams, ambitions, and a vision of a life where I wasn't constantly bailing out the people around me. But somehow, as I got older, the burden of responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders while my younger sister, Emily, got to be the golden child, the one who never had to lift a finger to clean up her own messes. Our mother made sure of that, doting on her, making excuses for her, and ensuring that no matter how badly Emily screwed up, someone else, usually me, would be there to make it right again. So when Emily announced she was engaged, it wasn't exactly a surprise when she came to me, wide-eyed and hopeful, asking for help. She and her fiancé, Jason, were struggling financially, barely scraping by, and they wanted a beautiful wedding but didn't have the means to afford it. Our parents, of course, had no savings to contribute, and rather than encourage Emily to plan something within her budget, they turned to me as if it was obvious that I would step in to make sure she got her dream wedding. "You can afford it," my mother had said, her tone light but expectant, like it was a given, like there was no real choice in the matter. I had worked hard to build my career, sacrificed nights, weekends, and relationships to get where I was, and I had earned every cent I made. But that didn't seem to matter when it came to family obligations, because in their eyes, my success was their safety net. I should have said no right then, should have drawn the line and forced Emily to take responsibility for her own life, but I didn't. I sighed, rubbed my temples, and asked her how much she needed. The number she gave me was ridiculous. Tens of thousands of dollars, enough to put a down payment on a house or buy a decent car. And yet I agreed. Maybe it was out of habit, maybe some deep part of me still wanted to be the good brother, or maybe I just wanted to get it over with. I wired the deposits, paid for the caterer, the florist, the photographer, even put money down on the damn venue. Emily was over the moon, thanking me profusely, calling me the best brother ever.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
And telling everyone how lucky she was to have such a supportive sibling. For a moment, I let myself believe she meant it. But then little things started to nag at me. I noticed how she avoided talking about the guest list when I asked, brushing me off with vague answers. I overheard a conversation between her and our mother where she mentioned something about certain guests being an issue, though she never clarified who. And then, one night, as I was heading out of a restaurant, I spotted Emily and Jason at a nearby table, whispering in hushed tones. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when my name came up, I froze. "I just don't want him there," Emily was saying, her voice sharp, not the sweet, grateful tone she had used with me before. "It's supposed to be my day, and I don't know, he just has this way of making everything about him." Jason murmured something I couldn't catch, and then Emily sighed dramatically. "I know he paid for it, but that doesn't mean he has to be there, right? I mean, it's my wedding. I should be able to decide who comes." I felt my stomach drop, a slow burning anger creeping up my spine as the realization sank in. I had just spent a fortune making sure my sister had the perfect wedding, and she was actively discussing how to keep me out of it. The betrayal stung in a way I hadn't expected, not just because of the money but because of the sheer audacity, the entitlement, the complete lack of appreciation. I left before I could hear the rest of the conversation, gripping my car keys so tightly my knuckles turned white. The pieces were starting to come together, and I didn't like the picture they painted. Emily had used me, manipulated me, and now that she had what she wanted, she was ready to throw me away like I was nothing more than an ATM. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I played dumb, continuing to smile when she gushed about wedding plans, nodding along as she talked about the most magical day of her life, pretending I had no idea what she was scheming behind my back. Because if Emily thought she could take my money and then ban me from her wedding without consequences, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. The wedding invitation arrived in the mail a week after I overheard Emily's conversation, and as I pulled the elegant envelope from the stack of bills and junk mail, I felt my stomach tighten with a sense of foreboding that I just couldn't shake. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had misinterpreted what she had said, that she couldn't possibly be planning to exclude me after everything I had done to make this wedding happen. But the moment I slid the invitation out and scanned the details, my hands clenched involuntarily, and a slow, simmering rage started burning deep in my chest. There it was, printed in delicate, expensive calligraphy. My name written alone without a +1. That in itself was strange enough, considering I had been dating someone for almost a year, and Emily damn well knew it. But then, just beneath my name, where most invitations would say, "We look forward to celebrating with you," or something equally warm and welcoming, there was a single line that felt like a slap to the face. "This invitation is extended for the ceremony only. No reception. No dinner. No celebration. Just the bare minimum acknowledgement that I existed, an obligation to invite me to the ceremony itself, where I could sit quietly in the back, clap politely, and then get the hell out before the real party began." The audacity of it, the sheer disrespect, was almost laughable. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove straight to Emily's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, she answered the door with that same beaming smile she always used when she wanted something. But the second she saw my face, the brightness dimmed slightly, as if she knew that whatever was coming wasn't going to be pleasant. "Mark," she chirped, tilting her head like she had no idea why I was there. "What's up?" I held up the invitation, shaking it slightly, my voice carefully controlled even though I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. "Care to explain this?" Emily blinked, her eyes darting to the invitation before she let out a nervous little laugh, the kind of laugh she used when she was trying to play something off like it wasn't a big deal. "Oh, that. Mark, come on, it's just..." "Just what?" I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "Just a mistake. Just an oversight. Just you trying to erase me from your wedding after I paid for the whole damn thing." Her face turned red, her mouth opening and closing like she was scrambling for an excuse, but then, just as quickly, she straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with that same entitled confidence she had carried since we were kids. "Look, Mark," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Jason and I talked about it, and we just think it would be better if you didn't come to the reception." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "Better for who, exactly?" Emily shifted on her feet, avoiding my gaze, and for the first time since I had arrived, she actually looked uncomfortable. "It's just, you know how you are," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always have such strong opinions and you take up so much space in a room, and Jason and I just want the focus to be on us that day, you know? We don't want any distractions." "Distractions?" I repeated, my voice like ice. "Emily, I paid for your damn wedding. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't even have a reception to begin with." Her expression turned defensive, like a child caught red-handed but still trying to justify their actions. "And we appreciate that," she said quickly. "But that doesn't mean we have to invite you to every part of the day. It's our wedding, Mark. It's supposed to be about us." I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around the sheer selfishness of what she was saying, trying to understand how she could take everything I had given her and then turn around and tell me I wasn't welcome to celebrate with them. And the worst part, she didn't even seem to realize how cruel it was. To her, it was just a decision, a small inconvenience, something she assumed I would just accept without complaint because that's what I had always done. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as she shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. And then, finally, I exhaled slowly, nodding once as I tucked the invitation back into its envelope. "Okay," I said simply. Emily blinked. "Okay," she echoed uncertainly, as if she had expected me to argue, to push back, to beg for an invitation like some desperate outsider trying to claw my way into her perfect little event. "Yeah," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. "It's your wedding, Emily. You should have it exactly the way you want it." Her shoulders relaxed, relief flooding her features as she smiled again, clearly thinking she had avoided some kind of scene. "Oh good," she said, letting out a small breath. "I'm glad you understand." I nodded once more, stepping back from the doorway, my eyes never leaving hers. "Yeah," I murmured. "I understand perfectly." And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, oblivious to the storm that had just started brewing in my mind. I drove home in complete silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, my mind running in furious loops around what had just happened, the sheer audacity of it all still rattling inside me like an unbearable itch I couldn't scratch. Emily had looked me in the eye, smiled like she was doing me a favor, and told me, without even a hint of guilt, that I wasn't welcome at the wedding I had paid for, as if my presence was some kind of stain on the perfect picture she was trying to create. The level of arrogance, the entitlement, the absolute lack of gratitude was staggering, and for the first time in my life I realized something important about my sister. She didn't see me as a person, not really, not as a brother, not as family, not as someone who had been there for her more times than she could count. No, to Emily, I was nothing more than a resource, An open wallet, a convenient solution to every problem she and our mother couldn't solve on their own. That realization settled deep in my chest, heavy and suffocating, but underneath it, buried beneath years of swallowed resentment and unspoken frustration, something else took root. Something sharper, something colder, something that made my lips curl into a slow, deliberate smirk as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. If Emily didn't want me at her wedding, if she thought I was too much of a distraction, if she truly believed that she could use me and then discard me like a piece of crumpled wrapping paper, then I was going to make sure she got exactly what she deserved. And it wouldn't be a scene, it wouldn't be some emotional confrontation, it wouldn't be yelling or pleading or demanding my rightful place at the celebration. No, it would be something much, much better. The first thing I did when I got inside was sit down at my computer, open my bank account, and begin making a series of very important phone calls. One by one, methodically, deliberately, making sure to keep my voice calm, polite, professional, like a man simply adjusting a few financial matters that had suddenly become inconvenient. The venue was the first to go, a simple cancellation of the final payment, nothing dramatic. Just a polite conversation with the event coordinator explaining that I would no longer be responsible for covering the outstanding balance. Next came the caterer, the photographer, the florist, the DJ. All of them receiving the same message, all of them suddenly realizing that the tens of thousands of dollars they were expecting would not be arriving as planned. And the best part, I didn't tell a soul. I simply sat back, folded my arms and waited, knowing full well that Emily, blissfully unaware of the chaos about to unfold, was still prancing around in wedding mode, completely convinced that her big day was secured, that everything was in place, that she had successfully gotten away with treating me like an afterthought. The thought of her standing in her overpriced dress, sipping champagne with her clueless bridesmaids, giggling about how she had handled me, made the anticipation even sweeter, because soon, very, very soon, she was going to find out just how wrong she had been. The first call must have come sometime that evening, though I ignored it, letting the phone buzz on the table while I scrolled through my laptop, casually sipping a drink, my heart rate perfectly steady despite knowing that the first cracks in her perfect day were already forming. A few minutes later, another call came through, then another, then a series of frantic text messages that started off polite and quickly descended into all-caps panic as she realized that something was very, very wrong. "Mark, I just got a call from the venue. They're saying the final payment wasn't made. Did something happen?" "Mark, the caterer is saying the same thing. Can you call me? Mark, what is going on?" I took my time before answering, letting her stew in the uncertainty, letting the panic build until I could practically feel it radiating from my phone, and then finally, after what must have felt like an eternity to her, I picked up and put the phone to my ear, my voice perfectly casual, as if I had just been woken up from a nap. "Hey, Emily," I said, dragging out the words lazily. "Everything okay?" "Okay," she screeched, her voice so shrill I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Are you serious right now? Mark, why are all these vendors telling me that the payments were cancelled? What the hell is happening?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling with a smirk as I listened to the raw panic in her voice, enjoying the rare and beautiful moment where my sister, my spoiled, self-absorbed, endlessly enabled sister, was finally experiencing what it felt like to have something yanked out from under her. "Oh, that," I said smoothly, pretending to suddenly remember. "Yeah, I decided not to pay for the wedding anymore. Figured it didn't really make sense, considering I'm not invited and all." Silence. Then an exhale, sharp and furious. "You can't be serious," she spat. "Mark, you already agreed to pay for everything. You can't just change your mind at the last second like this." I laughed, genuinely laughed, shaking my head in pure amusement at the audacity of the words coming out of her mouth. "Emily," I said slowly, savoring every syllable, "you literally uninvited me from the wedding I paid for. And you actually thought I was just going to let that slide." More silence, followed by a choked sound, somewhere between anger and disbelief, as if she truly, genuinely could not comprehend the idea that I might not simply roll over and take whatever treatment she decided to throw my way. "Mark," she tried again, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to come across that way, okay? I was just..." "No," I cut in smoothly, not interested in whatever excuse she was about to throw at me. "You made your decision, Emily. And now you get to live with it." And with that, I ended the call, watching as another wave of frantic messages poured in. But this time I didn't bother answering. I had given my sister everything she had wanted, everything she had asked for, and she had taken it all, smiled in my face, and thrown me away the second she no longer needed me. And now, she was going to learn exactly what it felt like when the person you rely on suddenly disappears, when the safety net you take for granted gets pulled out from under you. I leaned forward, cracked my knuckles, and opened my laptop, typing out the final details of my plan, my smirk widening as I imagined the look on her face when she realized the full extent of what I had done. Because this was only the beginning. The morning of the wedding arrived with a kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel fresh, new, and full of possibility. The sky clear and bright, as if the universe itself had decided to grant Emily the perfect day she had always dreamed of. The venue, a grand estate with sprawling gardens and towering oak trees, was decorated to perfection, with delicate white flowers adorning the aisles, soft golden lighting casting a warm glow over the ceremony space, and rows of elegantly dressed guests taking their seats, murmuring in excitement as they waited for the bride to make her grand entrance. Inside the bridal suite, Emily stood in front of an ornate mirror, adjusting the sparkling tiara nestled in her professionally curled hair. Her lips curled into a self-satisfied smile as she admired her reflection, drinking in the sight of herself in the designer wedding gown that had cost more than some people made in half a year. Everything was exactly how she had envisioned it. Every detail meticulously planned, every luxury paid for, every single piece of her fairy tale coming together flawlessly. And as she listened to the soft strains of classical music floating in from the ceremony space, she felt a rush of pure triumph wash over her. She had done it. She had gotten everything she wanted just like she always did. As her bridesmaids fussed around her, fluffing the layers of her gown, adjusting her veil, and squealing about how stunning she looked, Emily barely even registered the fact that she hadn't spoken to Mark since their last conversation, barely even thought about the way he had gone so cold, so quiet, so eerily composed before hanging up on her. She had been too busy, too wrapped up in final dress fittings and last-minute changes, too focused on making sure everything was flawless to waste time worrying about her brother's bruised ego. He would get over it, she had told herself. He always did. And besides, it wasn't like he could do anything about it now. The music shifted, signaling that it was time for her to make her way down the aisle, and Emily took a deep breath, letting the anticipation fill her chest, her heart pounding with excitement as she stepped forward, ready to bask in the adoration of her guests, ready to soak in the envy of her friends, ready to claim the perfect day she deserved. But then, just as she reached the end of the aisle, just as Jason turned to look at her with a practiced, loving smile, just as the officiant opened his mouth to begin the ceremony, the first call came in. First, no one really noticed. The wedding coordinator, a perky woman with a clipboard and a constant smile, had been standing near the back of the ceremony space, her phone discreetly tucked into her hand, and when it vibrated, she glanced down briefly before silencing it, refocusing her attention on the bride and groom. But then, less than a minute later, another call came. Then another. And another. Her expression tightened. Then, just as Emily was about to repeat her vows, one of the venue staff members appeared at the edge of the crowd. His brow furrowed, his expression tense as he murmured something into the coordinator's ear. She paled slightly, her fingers tightening around her clipboard, her eyes darting toward the bride and groom before she whispered something back, shaking her head urgently. The staff member hesitated, clearly unsure, then gave a sharp nod before hurrying back inside. Emily, caught up in the performance of the moment, barely noticed. It wasn't until the ceremony had concluded, until she had walked back up the aisle on Jason's arm, basking in the cheers and applause of their guests, that the first real sign of trouble emerged. The photographer, a well-known professional Emily had insisted on hiring despite his astronomical rates, had been waiting near the grand staircase for the post-ceremony pictures. His camera slung around his neck, his assistant setting up the lighting for the carefully staged shots Emily had requested weeks ago. But when the newlyweds approached, ready to begin their session, he hesitated, shifting awkwardly before clearing his throat and stepping forward. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, using her new last name as Emily had requested, his voice careful. "I just received a call from my office, and it seems there's been an issue with payment. I was under the impression that everything had been settled in advance, but unfortunately, my team has informed me that the final installment was never received." Emily blinked, the words not fully registering. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone sharp with impatience. "Everything was already paid for." The photographer hesitated again, his gaze flickering toward Jason, who looked just as confused. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, "but without payment, I won't be able to continue with the shoot. My team has already advised me to leave the premises if the balance isn't settled immediately." Jason frowned, shaking his head. "That doesn't make sense," he said, pulling Emily aside slightly. "Your brother was supposed to handle all of this, right? He said everything was covered." Emily felt a small twinge of unease crawl up her spine, but she shook it off, straightening her shoulders. "I don't know what's going on," she said stiffly, "but I'll fix it." Before she could even pull out her phone, another staff member appeared, this time the head of the catering team. His expression grim as he approached them. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, his voice tight with forced politeness. "I need to speak with you immediately regarding the catering service." Emily's fingers clenched around her bouquet. "What now?" The caterer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I've just been informed that the final payment for the catering has not been processed," he explained. "Our policy is very strict. We cannot serve any food or beverages without full payment, and unfortunately, since we haven't received the funds, our team will need to begin packing up." Emily's breath hitched, her pulse spiking. "What? That's impossible." She turned, looking frantically toward the reception hall, her gaze darting across the crowd of guests who were beginning to murmur, sensing that something was wrong. Then, as if on cue, another voice cut through the growing tension, a sharp, authoritative voice that made the blood drain from her face. "I need full payment. Now." Emily turned sharply, her veil whipping around her, and there, standing at the entrance of the grand ballroom, was the venue manager. His arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable but firm. The music had stopped. The murmurs had grown louder. And for the first time in her entire life, Emily Harrison realized that she had just lost control of everything. Emily stood frozen in place, her grip tightening around the delicate lace of her wedding dress, her mind racing a mile a minute as the venue manager's words echoed through the grand reception hall, bouncing off the polished floors and ornate chandeliers like the opening notes of a funeral march. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, a cold sweat forming at the base of her neck as she struggled to process the weight of what had just been said, the full payment demanded like a final, crushing blow to the dream she had so carefully constructed. This wasn't happening, it couldn't be happening, not to her, not today. Not after everything she had planned down to the last meticulous detail, not after she had worked so hard to make this the most perfect wedding anyone had ever seen. Guests were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their murmurs growing louder, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild amusement, and somewhere in the crowd, she could hear the unmistakable sound of a phone recording, the soft beep of a camera clicking, the distant hum of whispers spreading like wildfire through the carefully curated elegance of her big day. Jason turned toward her, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief, his hands tightening into fists at his sides as he leaned in close, his voice low and seething with barely contained rage. "What the hell is going on, Emily?" he hissed through clenched teeth, his breath hot against her ear, his patience fraying with every second that passed. "You told me everything was paid for, you told me your brother had taken care of it. So why the hell is the venue manager standing here demanding money like we're a couple of broke idiots crashing our own damn wedding?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper, her fingers shaking as she scrambled to pull her phone from the small jeweled clutch she had been carrying all day, her nails nearly cracking against the screen as she frantically scrolled through her messages, her vision blurring slightly from the overwhelming panic settling in her chest. There had to be a mistake, some kind of miscommunication, some stupid clerical error that could be fixed with a single phone call, because there was no way, absolutely no way, that Mark had actually done this to her. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial and desperation, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she had been too proud to acknowledge, the reality she had dismissed as impossible, the cold, brutal fact that she had seen coming and ignored because she had believed, foolishly, that Mark would never actually go through with it. Her brother had cancelled everything. "Emily," Jason growled, his voice rising now, his temper slipping further from his grasp as the weight of the disaster began to sink in, his hands moving to his hair in frustration as he took a slow step back, shaking his head in pure disbelief. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me this is just some mix-up. Tell me that I didn't just marry into the most humiliating, embarrassing, disastrous mess of a wedding in the history of mankind." Emily's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely type, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as she opened her banking app, her stomach twisting violently when she saw the numbers glaring back at her, taunting her, mocking her. She didn't have enough to cover everything, not even close, not with the extravagant spending she had justified in the months leading up to this day. Not with the way she had convinced herself that Mark would handle the final payments like he had promised, like he always did, like he always had. A cold, creeping dread slithered through her veins, her entire body locking up with sheer, paralyzing horror as she finally forced herself to open her messages. Her heart lurching into her throat when she saw the unread text waiting for her, the sender's name flashing across the screen like a death sentence. Mark. Her thumb hesitated for a fraction of a second before she tapped the message open, her breath catching in her chest as she read the words staring back at her, simple and devastating, cutting through every last thread of her composure like a sharpened blade. "Hope you love my wedding gift. You deserve it." The phone nearly slipped from her fingers, her entire body seizing up as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on her like a tidal wave, knocking the air from her lungs, stealing every last bit of control she had left. Her brother had done this. He had pulled the rug out from under her, stripped her perfect day down to its bare, humiliating bones, turned her dream wedding into an absolute nightmare, and the worst part was, she had walked right into it, blinded by her own arrogance, her own entitlement, her own selfish, short-sighted belief that Mark would always be there, always willing to clean up her messes, always too soft to ever strike back. She had underestimated him. Her fingers curled around her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her breathing uneven as she lifted her gaze, the reality of the situation settling in like a crushing weight on her shoulders, suffocating, unbearable. Guests were already standing, gathering their things, their curiosity giving way to mild boredom as they realized there would be no food, no music, no celebration, nothing but a bride in $1,000 dress trying, and failing, to salvage the ruins of the most expensive disaster they had ever witnessed. Jason let out a harsh, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he rubbed his temples. His patience officially shattered. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. His eyes filled with pure contempt as he glared at her. "This whole damn thing is a joke." Her mother was approaching now, her face twisted in panic, her hands wringing together as she tried to piece together what was happening, her voice high and frantic as she demanded answers. Emily barely heard her, barely registered the way her father was scowling at her in disapproval, barely noticed the way the venue staff was already beginning to clean up, moving chairs, taking down decorations, packing away the remnants of a wedding that had never even had a chance to begin. A sharp burst of laughter from somewhere in the crowd made her head snap up, her eyes landing on a group of guests huddled together near the entrance, their phones angled slightly as they whispered among themselves, smirking as they recorded the scene unfolding before them, capturing every last second of her humiliation, documenting the moment her fairy tale imploded for the entire world to see. A burning heat crawled up her neck, her pulse roaring in her ears, her vision swimming with fury, shame, and something dangerously close to tears. This wasn't just a disaster. This was a public execution. And Mark had been the one to pull the trigger. Emily had always been the kind of person who could convince herself that she was the victim in any situation, twisting the facts to fit whatever story made her look the most sympathetic, the most wronged, the most deserving of outrage on her behalf. But as she stood in the wreckage of her own wedding, surrounded by a crowd of unimpressed guests and furious staff demanding payment, she couldn't deny what had happened, couldn't rewrite the narrative fast enough to stop the growing whispers, the smirks, the judgment that thickened the air around her like a suffocating fog. This wasn't just a bad day, wasn't just an unfortunate mishap. This was public humiliation on a scale she had never imagined, a slow, agonizing downfall playing out in real time for everyone to witness, and the knowledge of who had orchestrated it burned like acid in her throat. The moment she was out of sight, ducking into the bridal suite with shaking hands and wild eyes, she grabbed her phone and started calling Mark, her fingers jabbing at the screen with a kind of furious desperation she hadn't felt since she was a teenager trying to talk her way out of a grounding. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second rang twice before cutting off. By the third, she was gripping the phone so hard that her nails left half moons in her palm, her voice coming out in a ragged snarl as she launched into a breathless, rage-filled tirade the second the voicemail beep sounded. "You are a miserable, pathetic excuse for a brother, Mark," she spat, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal, her vision blurring with furious tears as she tried, and failed, to regulate her breathing. "You think this is funny. You think ruining my wedding makes you some kind of genius. You are nothing but a bitter, jealous, vindictive piece of trash, and if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let this go, you're out of your damn mind. You owe me, Mark. You owe me for this disaster, and you are going to fix it, do you hear me? Call me back right now, or so help me." She cut herself off with a choked gasp, her own voice shaking so badly that she barely recognized it, her entire body trembling with adrenaline, fury, and something dangerously close to panic. She had spent her entire life getting her way, bending people to her will, making sure that no matter how badly she screwed up, someone would be there to clean up the mess, to take the fall, to make it right before it could become her problem. But this was unfixable, irreversible, a catastrophe so massive that she couldn't even wrap her head around where to start, and the only person who could undo it, the only person who had the power to repair what had been broken, was the same person who had orchestrated her downfall in the first place. Still, she wasn't done. For the next hour, she called him again and again, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one angrier than the last, her words becoming less coherent and more desperate as the reality of what had happened started to sink in, settling into her bones like a slow-moving poison. When it became clear that Mark wasn't going to answer, she switched tactics, calling their mother instead, knowing, practically counting on, the fact that she would take her side, that she would demand he fix what he had broken, that she would make him feel guilty enough to undo whatever damage had been done before it was too late. Her mother picked up on the second ring, her voice already tense, already sharp with accusation, already brimming with a kind of desperate urgency that told Emily she had already heard about what had happened, probably from one of the many guests who had started sharing the disaster online before the night had even ended. "Emily, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, skipping right over any pleasantries, her voice laced with exhaustion and frustration. "People are calling me, telling me the wedding was a complete disaster, that the venue shut everything down, that you were crying in your wedding dress while Jason was screaming at you in front of everyone. What happened? What happened?" Emily echoed, letting out a sharp, bitter laugh that didn't sound anything like herself. Her entire body vibrating with rage as she threw herself down onto the nearest chair, gripping the edge of the vanity table as if it could somehow ground her in reality. "I'll tell you what happened, Mom. Mark happened." Mark, in his infinite pettiness, decided that because his feelings were hurt, he was going to ruin the most important day of my life. And now I look like a complete idiot in front of everyone I know. This is all his fault, and you need to call him right now and make him fix it. Her mother sighed heavily, the kind of deep, weary sigh she only ever made when she was seconds away from losing her temper. "Emily," she said slowly, carefully, as if she were speaking to a child who didn't quite understand the consequences of her own actions. "Mark told me what you did. He told me you uninvited him after he paid for everything, and honestly, I can't even blame him for being upset. You should have known better." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" she breathed, barely able to process what she had just heard. Are you seriously taking his side right now?" "I'm not taking sides," her mother snapped, the exhaustion in her voice now mixed with something sharper, something dangerously close to disappointment. "I'm just saying you made a choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. Maybe next time you'll think twice before treating people like they're disposable." The line went dead before Emily could even think of a response. Outside the bridal suite, she could hear guests beginning to leave, their voices drifting through the hall in hushed tones, their laughter punctuated by the occasional ding of a phone notification, and with a fresh wave of horror, she realized that the wedding disaster had already started to spread online, the embarrassment expanding beyond the walls of the venue, reaching people who hadn't even been there to witness it in person. By tomorrow everyone would know. Jason returned, his face set in a deep scowl, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tuxedo as he paced near the doorway, his shoulders tense, his expression unreadable. "We're not going on the honeymoon," he said flatly, not even bothering to look at her. "I need time to think." Emily's mouth opened, then closed, no words coming out, her throat tightening as a wave of panic surged through her. "Jason, don't." "I'm done talking, Emily," he muttered, shaking his head. I don't even know who you are right now." Then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway, leaving her alone in her ruined wedding dress, her hair still perfect, her makeup still flawless, a picture-perfect bride in the middle of a picture-perfect disaster. Her phone buzzed one last time. It was Mark. She answered immediately, barely able to breathe, her voice cracking as the sob she had been holding back finally broke free, raw and desperate. "Mark, please." He was silent for a moment, letting her cry, letting her break, letting the weight of her choices press down on her like a crushing force. Then finally, his voice came through the receiver, calm and sharp as a knife. "This is what happens when you betray the wrong person." And then he hung up. The fallout from the wedding disaster spread faster than even Mark had anticipated, turning from a humiliating event into an outright spectacle that people just couldn't seem to stop talking about, dissecting every little detail like it was the juiciest gossip they had ever heard. Videos from the reception, some taken by amused guests and others by staff members who had been caught in the chaos, flooded social media, each one capturing the absolute train wreck of Emily's big day in stunning high-definition clarity. Clips of the venue manager demanding payment, the caterers packing up trays of untouched food, Jason shouting at Emily in front of a horrified crowd, and Emily herself, standing there in her pristine wedding dress, her face twisted in pure horror, circulated like wildfire, racking up thousands of views within hours. The internet was merciless. People on social media had a field day, turning the entire situation into one giant joke, making memes out of the most humiliating moments, sharing edited clips with dramatic sound effects, and speculating wildly about what could have led to such a disaster. Some blamed Emily, calling her entitled, selfish, and deserving of every bit of embarrassment she had suffered, while others called Mark a monster, accusing him of taking things way too far, of destroying his sister's life over what they saw as nothing more than a petty grudge. Mark didn't care about the opinions of strangers, though. What did surprise him was how divided his own friends were, their reactions varying wildly as he told them exactly what had happened, leaving out none of the details, making it clear that he had done it all with full intention, without an ounce of regret. Some of them laughed, clapping him on the back, telling him Emily had gotten exactly what she deserved, that it was about time someone put her in her place after years of using people without a second thought. Others, though, weren't so sure, their faces uneasy, their words cautious as they questioned whether he had gone too far, whether the revenge had been worth the permanent damage it had done. "I mean, I get it, man," one of his friends had said over drinks, swirling the ice in his glass. His brow furrowed with something close to concern. "She completely screwed you over, and yeah, she deserves some kind of payback, but this? You humiliated her in front of everyone she knows, probably ruined her marriage before it even started, and now the whole internet's laughing at her. That's not just revenge, Mark. That's total annihilation." Mark had taken a slow sip of his drink, considering the words, letting them roll around in his mind like dice being tossed across a table, waiting to see how they landed. He could acknowledge that his actions had been extreme, that there was no coming back from what he had done, that Emily would never, ever be able to erase what had happened from her life. But the part that surprised him the most, the part that should have made him feel something, guilt, remorse, even the faintest twinge of regret, just wasn't there. He felt nothing. His parents, on the other hand, had made their stance abundantly clear. His mother had called him within hours of the wedding collapsing, her voice shaking with fury, her words dripping with a kind of venom she had never once directed at Emily, no matter how much trouble she had caused, no matter how many mistakes she had made. "You have disgraced this family," she had seethed, not even giving him a chance to speak, not even attempting to understand his side of the story. "You have humiliated your sister, ruined her marriage, destroyed her reputation, and for what? Because your feelings were hurt. Because you weren't invited to a party. You are no son of mine, Mark. I want you to lose my number." And just like that, she was gone, cutting him off without hesitation, without a single shred of understanding, without once stopping to consider how she had raised Emily to be the kind of person who would do something like this in the first place. His father didn't bother calling at all, simply sending a short, curt text that read, "You took it too far. Don't contact us again." Mark stared at the message for a long time, letting the weight of it settle over him, waiting for the anger, the grief, the devastation that should have come with being cast out by his own parents. But just like before, just like every time he thought about what he had done to Emily, what he had taken from her, what he had left her with, there was no guilt, no remorse, no sadness. Just emptiness. Emily, predictably, tried to salvage what she could, throwing herself into frantic damage control in a desperate attempt to shift the narrative, painting herself as the victim, spinning sob stories about how her cruel and vindictive brother had gone out of his way to ruin her wedding out of pure jealousy. She reached out to friends, to extended family, to anyone who would listen, sobbing about how she had never meant to hurt Mark, how she had only wanted to have a day that was truly hers, how she had no idea he would react this way. But no one was buying it. The videos were too damning, the proof too overwhelming, and the sheer entitlement of her actions too obvious for people to ignore. The court of public opinion had already decided, and no matter how hard she tried to rewrite history, no matter how many people she begged to take her side, the reality was inescapable. Emily had used her brother for his money, discarded him when she no longer needed him, and had suffered the ultimate consequences for her greed. Her reputation was in ruins. Jason, unable to bear the humiliation of having his wedding turned into an internet spectacle, distanced himself almost immediately, dodging calls, canceling the honeymoon, and making excuse after excuse as to why they needed some time apart. It didn't take long for Emily to realize that he wasn't coming back, that he had decided she wasn't worth the baggage, that whatever love he might have had for her wasn't strong enough to survive the mess she had dragged him into. Mark heard about the breakup through a mutual friend, reading the text with a faint smirk before tossing his phone onto the couch, feeling a sense of satisfaction that was neither sharp nor overwhelming, but something dull and quiet, like the slow, steady release of pressure from a valve that had been ready to burst for years. He had won. Emily had finally faced the consequences of her actions, had finally been forced to confront the reality that she couldn't treat people like stepping stones without repercussions, had finally been knocked from the pedestal she had spent her entire life believing she deserved to stand on. And yet, for all of that, for the cold, clinical sense of justice that had been served, Mark couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was missing. Later that night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his laptop screen casting soft shadows across the walls, his eyes drifted to an old framed photo sitting on the bookshelf. A picture from when he and Emily had been kids, smiling wide, their faces filled with a kind of happiness and innocence that felt completely foreign now, belonging to another life, another version of themselves that no longer existed. For the first time since the wedding, something stirred in his chest, something small, something almost like regret, something almost like loss. Almost. Months passed, the seasons shifting from the crisp cool of autumn into the dead chill of winter, then slowly thawing into the first hints of spring, time moving forward despite everything that had happened, despite the wreckage left behind. Mark had barely thought about Emily in weeks, having buried himself in work, in late nights at the office, in weekends spent at the gym, in anything that kept him from lingering too long on the past. He had convinced himself that it was over, that there was nothing left to say, that he had made his point loud and clear, that Emily had gotten exactly what she deserved. But then, out of nowhere, the message came. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening, just as he was finishing dinner. His phone buzzing against the wooden surface of his kitchen table, the screen lighting up with a name he hadn't expected to see again, a name he had almost convinced himself was gone for good. Emily. For a long time, he just stared at it, the name glaring back at him like an accusation, the weight of it settling into his chest like a stone. A part of him had always known this moment would come, had always expected that eventually, when enough time had passed, when she had exhausted every other option, when the dust had finally settled, she would reach out, hoping to rewrite the ending, to smooth over the damage, to pull him back into the cycle that had defined their entire relationship for as long as he could remember. Still, he hesitated before opening the message, a strange tightness in his throat. His fingers hovering over the screen as if touching it would make the past real again, as if responding would undo everything that had already been set in stone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled slowly and tapped the notification. Emily. I know I don't deserve a response, and I know you probably don't even want to hear from me, but can we talk? Please. He stared at the words for a long time, reading them over and over, searching for something beneath the surface, some sign that this was another manipulation, another attempt to pull him back in, another way to shift the blame onto him the way she always had. But for once, there was nothing there except quiet desperation, a rawness he wasn't used to seeing from her, a vulnerability she had never allowed herself before. Still, he wasn't sure if that meant anything. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face, weighing the options, debating whether he even cared enough to respond, whether he wanted to give her the satisfaction of knowing he had read it, whether he wanted to open a door that he had so deliberately slammed shut. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let it sit there unanswered, to move on as if she had never reached out at all. And yet, something inside him, something he couldn't quite name, made him hesitate. Before he could make a decision, before he could type a single word, his phone buzzed again. Second message. But this one wasn't from Emily. This one was from someone unexpected. His breath caught slightly as he read the name on the screen, his pulse slowing, his fingers tightening around the phone as a strange, unfamiliar feeling crept up his spine, something uneasy, something uncertain, something that sent a chill through his veins despite the warmth of the room. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there staring at it, his mind racing with 1,000 different possibilities, 1,000 different outcomes, 1,000 different questions he suddenly wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. And then, just as his thumb hovered over the message, just as he prepared himself to open it, to face whatever was waiting for him on the other side, the screen faded to black. And that was the end. Or maybe it was just the beginning.